Welcome to the tutorial on how I approach painting magic and visual effects. My emphasis in university and my first job in the gaming industry was actually in visual effects, so this topic is very close to my heart. Of course, in games and film, it can be a little bit different since you're not usually directly drawing the effects and are instead working with tools like particle simulations, shaders, and 3D geometry, but there are still some basic principles that are good to know whether you're painting visual effects as a still image or you're making them for a game. Something that's crucial to always keep in mind when you create effects, be it water, smoke, fire, magic, or even hair, are the forces that act on the effect. We're going to get a tiny bit sciencey for a second. What makes smoke move in wisps and wiggle around fluidly like it does? Not only is the smoke affected if there's something like air movement or a breeze around it, but how it moves is also affected by temperatures. Hot air rises faster, so the start of a smoke stream will usually rise faster and have a little bit more of a direct path because it's hotter and closer to the source of the heat. But as the smoke cools, its path starts to meander more and more as it starts to slow down due to its temperature chilling. These temperatures are also why mushroom clouds happen in big explosions. Hot air from the explosion is shooting up, but the air at the top of the explosion is cooling and slowing down. The force of the hot smoke from below as it pushes on the cooling smoke above causes that mushroom shape. Smoke and explosions are the most obvious demonstration of these temperature causing these shapes, but this also happens with fire and even water. Fire is highly unstable and is very affected by the air movement around it. As fire licks up and off of itself in little bits, the edges cool and curl down, just like the mushroom cloud. That's why you can get this little arcing M shapes that come off of fire. Something else to keep in mind with all of these elements, but especially fire, is that the smaller it is, the smoother and less detailed it will appear. Think like a candle flame. And the larger it is, the more jagged the details. So lots of little details, kind of like this car fire. I don't want to overload you too much with detail in the science, and you don't have to keep it all in the forefront of your mind every time you draw or paint visual effects, but it's just good to have a basic understanding so that when you start painting, you will sort of know what shapes and motion make your effect more believable and grounded in nature, because you will know that there's these forces that act on the element creating those shapes. Let's move on to some super basic design rules that will help you out. Source or origin point. The effect will radiate out from some sort of source. Be it fire, magic, or smoke, you can choose an origin point, and from there the element will spread out and radiate from that point. This is mostly applicable to an origin of magic, like I'm doing in this illustration, or something with a single origin point. Obviously, something like a lake isn't going to follow this rule, and something like a fire on a tree will have a much larger origin point, being like the entire tree instead of just one pinpoint. But let's keep it simple for now and stick to a one origin point for practicing effects. Shape repetition. You will have generally repeating shapes in your effect. Maybe that means angular triangle shapes in your fire or curvy curls in your magic or smoke. Whatever your element is will kind of determine these shapes, and also your style. So you just don't want to mix contrasting shapes too much. If you have something that's a curvy kind of element, you want to stick to a little bit more of those same curvy shapes. You don't really want to mix in like jaggedy fire shapes if you already have curvy shapes. So you want to repeat whatever shape language you are going with. big, medium, and small shapes. Even though the shape is generally repeated, you must vary up your shapes to be different sizes. This is much more natural and appealing design. Be very careful to notice and avoid any shapes that are exactly the same size. Our brain really likes to make these exact same repeating shapes that are the same shape, the same size, the same everything. You have to pay attention and make sure to change those up: big, medium, and small. Avoid parallel lines. Again, the human brain just loves to create parallels for some reason, and these are something you really want to avoid in something as naturalistic as, well, anything in your art, but especially as naturalistic as elements and effects, because it just is very unusual in nature to have exact parallel lines, and it makes things feel really stiff really fast. So make sure to notice and break those parallels to add variety. Asymmetry. Another thing that is almost impossible in nature is symmetry, and even more so in things like elements. So to add interest and believability, again, it's really, really important to make sure your effects are not completely symmetrical. Fire might be blowing a little more to one side, a small fly-off chunk of an explosion might be going one way, etc., etc. You can think of ways to break up the shape. If you notice your effect is a little bit too symmetrical, try and think of ways to break it up a bit to add that asymmetry. Now I want to talk a little bit about how I like to approach painting effects. I actually like to use a solid brush and I just start painting in the shape. At the same time, I use the eraser to carve away and refine the shapes. I tend to avoid doing line art for visual effects. I know I usually love line art, but when it comes to effects, I don't really like to do very much line art. I don't use a pencil, I don't sketch it out, I don't do line art, I just go straight directly into the shape, because sometimes I can get a little bit too caught up in the details of the line art and the effect, and it starts making the effect look a little bit too stiff and unnatural. If I really want to add line art later on, like maybe it's some very stylized smoke or something, I will paint in the whole shape first, and then I will go over top with line art afterward, almost like a later step of the process, which I know most of the time my process is like sketch, line art, and then color, but for effects, for some reason, it's the opposite. It's shape, color, and then line art on top if I need it. But the way we're going to approach it today, since we're going to use a lot of glow, we're actually not going to add line art over top. Speaking of color and glow, we're about to launch into that, but just give me 2 seconds because this video is brought to you by my patrons. It's not a sponsored video. It's just a tutorial that I made over on Patreon like a year and a half ago, and now I'm bringing it to you guys publicly on YouTube. But I wanted to let you guys know that when you join my Patreon, you not only are supporting me and my work, but you also gain access to tons of rewards, including over 50 video tutorials, 18 advice articles that go over art advice, art business advice, stuff like that. And then, of course, all of the digital rewards for all of my artworks, including line art, sketches, wallpapers, process shots, layered work files, all of that kind of stuff. And if you are an art collector, I also offer limited edition numbered and signed prints and stickers and even spicy prints. So all of that stuff is over on Patreon. If you want to check it out and support my work, I would really appreciate it. Let's get back to the tutorial. The way we're going to approach it today, since we're going to use a lot of glow, we're actually not going to add line art over top. Now that I have the basic effect shape painted in, I lock the transparent pixels of that layer. Use a soft airbrush to paint in some color gradients and transitions. It's at this point where I like to start playing with what kind of colors I actually want my effect or my spell to be. A general rule I like to follow when painting colors is to keep the brightest and hottest colors closest to the focal point and epicenter, or the origin of the magic. So for this piece, the origin point is between her hands where she's conjuring the spell. And then using that soft airbrush, I paint the colors to be a little bit darker and transition a bit cooler the further away from the epicenter they are. So the smoke that's at the edges of the page are darker than the smoke that's closer to the origin of the spell. Here's a quick trick that can help your glowy effects pop even before you add the actual glow layer on top. Create a new layer under your magic layer. Choose a dark color that goes along with your color scheme. I chose a dark purple here, but blue could work too. With a soft airbrush, gently paint in this dark color behind your magic. Placing this soft darkness behind your effect helps add contrast so that the magic really stands out even more. I sometimes even use this trick when making particle effects in video games so that the effect that I'm making, whether it's a player skill or a spell or whatever, can stand out against a soft, dark particle even when it's in a bright environment. Once I'm generally happy with the gradient, I sometimes might adjust the color to experiment by using the hue, saturation, and luminosity sliders. Now we're going to add some actual glow. Duplicate your spell layer and switch the layer mode to add/glow. Doing this will probably blow out your effect to almost white like this. Don't worry, we'll fix that. Go to your filter, blur, Gaussian blur. Crank that blur strength up to where you think it looks good. Mine is at about 46. Now go to edit, tonal correction, hue and saturation. Pull up the saturation and lower the luminosity. This will help the glow layer not blow everything out too white. You can also play with what color you want the actual glow to be as well. For something like fire, I would recommend going a little bit more like orange or red. For something like magic, there's really no rules. Choose something that you think looks good with your spell. So now we have a small glow in our effect, but I actually want an additional glow that's a little bit more spread out. So I'm going to create a new layer, switch the layer mode to either add glow or glow dodge. You can see which look you like better for your artwork. And for this spell, I'm changing my color to a sort of magenta. With a soft airbrush, paint over top of the spell. Remember that the epicenter is where most of the energy is, so that's where I want most of the glow. While I'm at it though, I'll add a little bit more glow to some of the other areas of the spell, and I'll even add a little bit of this glow to the character herself, where the glow of the magic is actually going to be casting light on her. It's important to remember that anything that has a light source will affect how your characters and other objects in the scene are lit, and what colors are casting on them. So remember to adjust the colors and lighting on your characters and other things in your scene if you need to. That way, the magic will seem more grounded and a part of the illustration itself. Now I like to use a speckly brush just to add some little small particle details. This is just a final detail that adds a little bit more interest to the effect. It also creates those really small detailed shapes to contrast the larger shapes of the effect. Now you know the basics of how I approach drawing effects. Fun, right? Stuff that you could do to push your magic spell further is more like style choices. Maybe you erase away some of the areas that are a little bit more semi-transparent, or you blur and smudge other areas. Perhaps there are some darker, soft smoke shapes behind the glowing effect. These are all up to you and are more detail and like stylized polish. As a bonus, let's try a quick lightning spell. It'll be more jagged and less wispy because that's how electricity tends to be, but we can still follow essentially the same design principles. Starting from the spell origin point, I kind of want to mimic the sort of thing that you see with those lightning balls where you can touch the glass and the lightning will go to your finger. So I'm going to put a sort of circle-ish shape around the origin, and then from there I'll have the lightning arc out to her fingertips. Something that's a bit different with lightning is that it is obviously way more jagged and erratic. Honestly, I don't really get the science behind lightning. It's literal magic to me. So the idea of different temperature changes that help guide me with things like smoke and fire aren't necessarily helping me here, but I try and follow the art and design ideas of shape repetition, size variation, asymmetry, and no parallel lines. I also know that lightning likes to arc around and connect to things, so having little flyaways that arc away from the lightning itself and then back into itself is pretty satisfying to the shape. The process of painting and coloring the lightning is exactly the same as I did for the other spell, using a hard brush to just paint and erase to find the shapes that I want, and then locking the transparent pixels to softly paint in the colors. I'm going to go with yellow for the lightning, so a brighter yellow / white in the center and then a darker yellow as it moves away from the center. And then both glow layers. For the dark color behind, I'm actually going to go a little bit more dark red because I think that contrasts really well with the yellow. This tutorial couldn't be complete without a simple fire demo. We'll follow the same principles, but the difference with fire is that it's a lot less wispy and reaching tendrils around. Instead, it will be very focused around the origin point, with its velocity mostly reaching up, but with a little bit of wiggle because of the forces and the temperature changes that affect the shape. This is a relatively small fire, so I'm aiming for a little more detail than a candle, but not as much detail as something like a torch might have. For colors, remember that the hotter area at the source of the fire is going to be lighter and more yellow, or even white or blue if it's really hot. And then it will get oranger and redder the further up it goes, because the flames and the flame licks are cooler. Usually when you paint fire, you can also paint in a hotter core. I do this on a separate layer above the base flames, that way I can easily erase and edit the shape if I want to. And of course, with fire, you want to add that nice red or orange glow as well as the soft darkening behind the flames. The neat thing about adding this darkening to the fire effect is that not only does it help the fire pop out more, but it can also add a little bit of that soot or smoke feeling to the fire without having even drawn in the smoke yet. That is essentially it for my basic effects and magic tutorial for illustrations. I hope you enjoyed it. I find effects to be extremely fun to work on. They're a little bit abstract but informed by design as well as science. But also, the more you practice these kind of shapes and curves and principles that are super duper important to visual effects, the better you will get at all of your art in general. Something else that is kind of a visual effect that adheres to a lot of these same rules are things like cloth and hair. So the more you practice with like smoke and fire, the better you will actually become with things like cloth and hair as well. So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. I hope it was helpful and gave you some insights into how I paint visual effects and how I think about them. I will include all of the brushes that I used in this tutorial in the Patreon post. Thank you guys so much for all of your support. It really means the world. I couldn't do this without you guys. So thank you so much. And I will talk to you next time. Bye!